William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I welcome you to another Two Hats special of community events. Let's look in and see what's really happening.
I have something I wanted to talk to you today. It's this lifelong mystery that I've dealt with. It has to do with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, you know who she is. She's the African-American woman who supposedly, according to history, according to legend, sort of kicked off the desegregation movement. December 1, 1955, she was riding on a segregated bus in the South, and the story was that the driver told her to get out of her seat so this white man could sit down, and according to legend, she was this humble, quiet lady just sitting there staring at her feet, and humble, dignified, soft-spoken, not angry, never raised her voice. That's all part of the Rosa Parks legend. And she was told to get out of her seat, and her feet hurt. Her feet were tired. She just couldn't do it. And so she didn't get out of her seat, and stuff happened after that. And so the whole, it's kind of like the civil rights movement was kicked off by this one little modest, humble moment of rebellion by this African-American lady on a bus. I've always had some problems with that story. In the 70s, I was a reporter in Detroit, and Rosa Parks was living in Detroit. She was an older lady by then. And I had a friend, a fellow reporter named Susan Watson, who was supposed to have a relationship with Rosa Parks. The paper we worked for had this idea that Susan knew Rosa Parks. And so every few years we'd get a new editor from somewhere. And the editor would say, "Hey, doesn't that Rosa Parks live here?" And so on the anniversary of the Rosa Parks bus incident, whoever the new editor was would say, "Hey, go over to Susan Watson and say, Susan, I understand you know Rosa Parks. Why don't we do a story about what she's up to?" And in the culture of newspapers, when you have a connection like that and the editor wants you to do a story, you say yes. "Oh, yeah, I got Rosa Parks in my pocket. I'll go do the Rosa Parks story." So the editor would walk off, and Susan would let out this huge sigh, like she'd just been hit in the head with a baseball bat. And she'd trundle off to go talk to Rosa Parks again. And then she'd come back to the paper, and she sat right across from me, which is why I knew all this. And she would talk to herself and say, "That lady is so mean. I hate going out there. Oh, I wish I could never have to talk to Rosa Parks again for the rest of my life." And I talked to Susan about it, and part of it, Susan was fairer than that about it, and she said in Rosa Parks' defense, Rosa Parks was just sick of doing this same story year after year. So Susan shows up at her door, and Rosa Parks would say, "Not you again. We did this 3 years ago. I have nothing new to say." And then Susan would have to wheedle and plead and say, "Please let me do my story." And finally Rosa Parks would give in and give her some kind of interview. But I said to Susan, I thought my image of Rosa Parks was this sweet little old lady who just that one day on the bus, she just ran out of patience. And Susan gave me this cold stare, and she stuck her finger in my face. She used a word that I can't repeat on the air for things that are not true. The initials for the word are B.S. And she said, "Whoever said that lady was a sweet lady was handing out a line of total BS." And so that story always stuck in my head. There's another thing I want to get to that has to do with Dallas and buses and research that I did back in the 70s, which led me to this, for me, amazing discovery, because I never got it in school, which was that Dallas was having mini riots over bus segregation in the 1940s, 15 years before Rosa Parks. And Dallas, I was the story about Dallas was, there was never any trouble here. Yeah, people just lived with the system, with segregation. And I'll tell you about in a minute how I came to this discovery that I don't know about them living with the system, but I found evidence of riots, people pouring off the buses, black people pouring off segregated buses in the 40s, all kinds of squad cars and cops and people rocking the bus and threatening to set it on fire. I'm not laughing because I think that's funny. It's just so ironic because it's so much at odds. And also, it was the second piece of my little Rosa Parks puzzle that I didn't get. I thought, according to the history books that I got in high school and in college, everybody kind of accepted it until Rosa Parks didn't. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Rosa Parks. Let me see how much time I got left. I got some time. So, I was talking about Dallas and bus segregation back in the day. And the story about Dallas in particular is always that, there was never any trouble here. So, I was doing this research back in the 80s for a book I was working on. And it involved reading the old newspapers on microfilm at the library, the Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald and the African American newspapers. And I came across this weird thing one day in the Morning News. The Morning News was always the more conservative paper, and the Herald was the more liberal paper, so-called, for the time. So the thing in the Morning News was this little story, I can almost quote it. There was not an incident last night at 8 p.m. at Bonneview and Ledbetter, contrary to erroneous reports. Just a few lines. No disturbance took place on the city bus, the Dallas Transit System bus. And I thought, that's weird. I have a story saying something didn't happen. So I quick jumped to the Times-Herald for the same day. And it said, reports of an incident at Bonneview and Ledbetter last night were highly erroneous. More than 100 people did not pile off a city bus and rock the bus, threatening to set it on fire. Far fewer than the reported 60 patrol cars showed up. Blah, blah, blah. All this detail. And so then you go, sometimes I was able to go, because I found a bunch of incidents like this. And sometimes I was able to go to the black newspapers, which would have a little more detail, and so the picture that emerges is something happened at Bonneview and Ledbetter on that night, and that led me to look more closely at bus segregation. How did bus segregation work? The story I had gotten in the history books was always pretty simple, that there was a black part of the bus and a white part of the bus. That's not how it worked, and it's significant to know how it really worked. How am I doing? Okay. On a Dallas bus, there were 12 ceramic signs, 12 of them, that could be hung at different parts of the bus. And they said colored or white. And it was up to the bus driver to move the signs around. So if you had 30 black riders and 10 white riders, you'd adjust the signs so that there were more black seats. The black section, which was toward the back of the bus, would be bigger, and the white section smaller. And the bus driver was supposed to be watching this so he could keep it right so, everybody could sit down. But the bus drivers, for whatever reason, wouldn't watch it and wouldn't move the signs necessarily. So you'd have like 5 white people on the bus, and you'd have 20 seats in the white section, so 15 of them would be empty. You'd have way more black people on the bus if it was headed at the end of the day from North Dallas to Southern Dallas, but the bus driver would leave too few seats in the black section. So you got black people standing up because they don't have enough seats, and then you have all these empty seats in the white section. And the thing that emerges from these newspaper stories is that nobody stayed quiet about it. The black people would shout to the bus driver, "Hey, you need to move the sign." I'll come back to this story after this, talking about Rosa Parks. The 100th anniversary of her birth is coming up. She died in 2005. She's the lady who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus and spurred a great reaction that became what we think of as the civil rights movement. But I've been talking about the kind of the difference between the Rosa Parks legend and these little windows that I had into the reality of Rosa Parks. She seemed like a lot, from people I knew who knew her, she seemed like a lot pricklier, edgier, tougher person, not the little sweet old lady sitting on the bus that the history books project. And then I said before the break that I also came across this evidence in doing research on the history of Dallas, that far from being the first person to do this, here in Dallas, where everybody always tells you that the lid was on, there was never any trouble here, there were many riots over bus segregation back in the 40s. 15 years before Rosa Parks. And I was explaining before the break how the bus segregation worked. There were these signs on the buses, and the bus driver's supposed to move them up and down to adjust the size of the black seats and the white seats. And they didn't always do it. For whatever reason, they were busy, or they didn't feel like it, or they were mean, and they wanted to make the black people stand up, whatever. They didn't always do it. And so the black people would tell the bus driver, "Move the sign." And the bus driver would sometimes refuse. The other piece of the puzzle here that emerged when I read these stories that I thought was really interesting was the black passengers would wait until that bus was in the black part of town, so that bus driver knew if something happened, he wasn't going to get much help from the people around him. He was in black Dallas now. And then they would insist, "Move that sign." And some of the bus drivers were hard-headed and wouldn't do it and wouldn't move the sign. And then there would be this violent reaction. I don't know what happened because it's so covered up in the reporting and the history of the time, but whatever happened involved up to 50 patrol cars for one incident. That's back when Dallas was a way smaller place. We'd think of it as smaller than Tyler is now. 50 patrol cars had to be the whole police force, getting people out of bed. So these were big deals, and it meant that nobody ever accepted bus segregation. Now the other piece of the puzzle that came clear for me about Rosa Parks came when I finally read Taylor Branch's wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning book, published, I'm thinking that it was late 90s. It's called Parting the Waters, and it's a top-to-bottom scholarly reportage of the whole civil rights movement, and in particular he deals with the Rosa Parks thing, and he explains how the Rosa Parks incident on the bus happened. There was nothing spontaneous about it. It was entirely planned and strategic, and she was chosen for the part. And I'll come back to that in a second. We've been talking about Rosa Parks and the bus desegregation, and some of my personal experiences with the Rosa Parks story. And I was explaining how Taylor Branch in his book Parting the Waters explained how Rosa Parks how that all really happened. Rosa Parks worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and she's sometimes described as a secretary there. That doesn't quite get it. She was an activist. She was a trained activist. She chose to work there. She was part of the deal, part of the staff. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided that they were going to have an incident around bus desegregation, and they timed it, and they planned it, and they made sure that when it started, there would be reporters on the bus to see it. In fact, they chose another woman who was going to be the woman to refuse to give her seat up, but they vetted her first. And this is an example of how strategic the SCLC was and how smart they were. And they knew that the media would start looking into the background of whoever was this woman chosen for this role to refuse to give up her seat. The first woman they chose had had a child out of wedlock, as it was described back then. She had a baby and she wasn't married. Now, I'm not sure that would be a big sticking point for anybody, but this was the 50s, and it would have been a big deal that she would have been portrayed as immoral and so on. So they passed on her, and they chose Rosa Parks instead because she had a spotless past. So this thing was scripted, and the reporters were told when it was going to happen, and Rosa Parks knew what she was going to do. She was going to refuse to give up her seat. It's very unlike the story that's told in the history books of this quiet, modest little lady who just her feet hurt and so on. Now, I'm talking about this because there's a review in the New York Times this morning of a new Rosa Parks book. It's called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks by Jean Theoharis, a Brooklyn College professor. And it tells who Rosa Parks really was. Quite unlike the mythological story that last time I checked, kids in high school were still being given this story of Rosa Parks, the little quiet lady, staring at her feet. That's not who she was. She was always an angry, rebellious person who hated segregation, and I'm sorry to say, for folks who look like me, hated white people. Yeah, right. Here's a quote from this new book. Quote, "How I hated all white people, especially him." She's talking about a guy, an employer who tried to rape her. So that makes it a little more understandable. Later, as a participant in the civil rights movement, she took part in training sessions with white people, and she decided, okay, something can be worked out between us and white people. It wasn't exactly what we think of as integration today. It was a more separatist view, but she decided there were some white people she could live with. Her grandfather was a follower of Marcus Garvey, who was a black separatist, and he was a guy who used to sit on his porch, according to this book review by Charles M. Blow in the Parks today. Parks's grandfather used to sit on his porch with a rifle, hoping that the Klan would show up so he could shoot somebody. And Rosa Parks, as a little girl, used to sit with him because, as she says in the book, quote, "I wanted to see him kill a Ku Kluxer." So this is not a little quiet lady, ever. When she was a little kid, according to the book, a young white man taunted her. I don't know what the taunt was, but she threatened to kill him with a brick. Her grandmother took her aside, told her that she was too high-strung and that she was going to get lynched before the age of 20. Rosa responded, quote, "I would be lynched rather than be run over by them." But what her grandmother didn't tell her, and her parents didn't tell her, was to be sweet and humble. They told her to keep her anger under control, but to keep her anger. They didn't tell her she was wrong to be angry. They just said, be cool. Watch what you do. Don't give them a chance to lynch you. But don't give up your anger. So this Rosa Parks that emerges from this new book is not like the legend of Rosa Parks, but it is like the lady who lived in Detroit when I was there. My friend Susan Watson always had to go out and interview, and Susan would come back and say, "She is so mean." And she did have a mean streak. She married Raymond Parks, who was a civil rights activist, who carried a gun, and that impressed her because she said, quote, he refused to be intimidated by white people. So here's the real Rosa Parks emerging. Tough, smart, very angry at white people, and very determined to do something about it. And here's the real Rosa Parks incident on the bus, not spontaneous, planned, choreographed, scripted for the media. So you have this question, or I have this question, okay, how come it was told the other way? Because it was, look, it was the Rosa Parks legend is there because that's how it was told by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I got to say one thing for white folks here. We didn't make that story up. That came from the African American leadership of the Civil Rights Movement. And we can talk about why that would be, why it would be told that way, and why it's taken all these years to peel the onion and get back to the real Rosa Parks story. I want to get to something that came up in a Dallas City Council retreat of all things last week about some of this history and the story that black ministers in Dallas were hostile to integration and hostile to Martin Luther King Sr. There's another, in this council retreat, believe it or not, this came up, and the Reverend Zan Holmes, who's the emeritus pastor of St. Luke Community Methodist, gave a little window on the truth there, which is like this Rosa Parks story. It's the truth is quite different from the legend, nationally and locally. We've been talking about Rosa Parks and some of the way the legend of the civil rights movement is told and how far it is from what really happened. And in the last section of the show, I want to get to why that might have been. Bottom line, I don't know, but I have a two-bit theory, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think about it as well. The point being that this story was told at the time as the Rosa Parks story was this sort of quiet, humble, staring at her feet lady, soft-spoken, sweet little old lady, just tired, and her feet were hurting, and she didn't want to get up. There's this new book, and there's a review of it in the New York Times today about the real Rosa Parks story. One of the quotes in it was, "I didn't tell anyone my feet were hurting. It was just popular, I suppose, because they wanted to give some excuse other than the fact that I didn't want to be pushed around." Now that sounds like the real Rosa Parks that I knew of from back when I was in Detroit and she was living in Detroit, and I knew people who knew her. That sounds like the Rosa Parks I knew of, not the Rosa Parks that high school kids are taught, and I'm afraid college kids are still taught, who's the quiet little old lady who just, couldn't get up because her feet were hurting her. That's not what happened, and that's not who Rosa Parks was. And so when we come back for the last part of the show, we want to talk about why the story would have been told that way. Because it wasn't told that way by white people. White people believed it, and it's kind of what they maybe wanted to hear, but it was the leadership of the civil rights movement, African American leadership, that created this Rosa Parks legend. We're talking about Rosa Parks and desegregation and how it all happened. And the occasion for talking about this is a column that's kind of a book review in the New York Times this morning on the op-ed page by Charles M. Blow, a new book on Rosa Parks. And I've been talking about the incredible difference between the Rosa Parks legend and the reality. And the reality was that she was way tougher and edgier, meaner than the story. And I've also been talking about the difference between the legend of Dallas, which was that everybody always got along and Dallas didn't have any problems. It's just absolutely untrue. And the fact that there were riots over bus segregation in Dallas in the 1940s. So Black people never accepted it. Never accepted it. And Rosa Parks wasn't just sitting there with her head, her hands in her lap, staring at her knees for years, thinking, oh, this is okay. Yeah, it's okay. It's all right that I have to stand up when there are empty seats in the white section, because that's how it is. We get this story that it was, quote, a way of life, and that people accepted it. Well, the reality is that nobody ever accepted it. Not happily. So, why? Why was the story told the way it was? And why did the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference feel that it was important to tell it that way? Well, historically, strategically, the civil rights movement was giving white people a lot to chew on. They were saying, this is over. The segregation stuff is over. And here we come. But they were also doing it, and this is an important piece of the puzzle, by appealing to the white conscience. The Martin Luther King Jr. sent those children against the police dogs on purpose. Other people in the SCLC said, Martin, don't send children out there. Don't send our kids out there against those dogs. They'll be bitten. And he said, they're going. That was set up. That was meant to happen, so that those images would be on television, so that white people would see themselves in this horrific mirror. Oh my God, how could we be doing that? So there was a very important appeal to white conscience. Don't forget that white people were very important to the civil rights movement and to the change. 1963 and 65 is when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, and I always get them mixed up. I don't remember which was which, but I remember that it was LBJ, a white Texan, who pushed that through. And it took a ton of white votes to get those things done, including white Southern votes. I grew up in the North. I've lived my adult life in Texas, so I'm aware that this story that we have about how all the racism was in the South and all the segregation was in the South, that's another thing that's absolutely not true. The town I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, supposed to be a big liberal bastion, was harshly segregated in the 50s. There was a street through the middle of town called Division Street, and everybody on one side of Division Street was white, and everybody on the other side was black. That's another story. Before I go back to my blah, blah, blah and my bad personality syndrome, let me pause. We got a caller here, Ann, on line 3. Ann, what's up with you today?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm impressed that you know so much about the Rosa Parks story. What really disappoints me is the fact that you assume that people didn't know this story. I'm African American. I was raised in the Midwest. I went to a private university down here. And in my college, it was no. That's what we were taught.
Tell me, Ann, it's breaking up a little, but you said something important I didn't quite get. Tell me what you were taught again.
We were taught that it was the strategic planning by the Southern Leadership Conference. We were taught that. And it had to be planned. It had to be planned, and it had to be filmed. It had to be photographed.
Right.
It had to be that way, or it wouldn't have worked.
It wouldn't have happened.
And that, what amazes me, or actually what disturbs me, is the fact that you make such a big deal about that. Like it's something wrong. My grandparents were from Mississippi.
Uh-huh.
My grandmother's mother would go into Jackson, Mississippi, and she was so fair-skinned that she could easily pass for white, and that was the only way she could get an office job.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So, they
Yeah.
were, unfortunately, at a point when my grandfather got older, they had land, they had a house, and yes, the KKK came, didn't like the fact that they were doing so well and gave them 24 hours to leave the state. And it was a nice thing they did, because normally they would just shoot your head.
Right.
Right? So it was bad in the South.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
My father was born and raised in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
He went to a private, one of the top schools in Chicago, and it was an all-boys school, and it was predominantly white.
Uh-huh.
Didn't have any problem.
Right.
Home with them, they would come over there. My mom, when they moved to Chicago when she was 4 years old, she went to a very integrated high school.
Right.
Wasn't like that in every northern city where you're saying, oh, there was segregation up there too.
Yeah.
Sometimes the socioeconomic segregation. And if you were black, they had some money, and you lived in the north, you didn't have to worry about someone coming, taking your land, raping your daughter, beating you to death, and not have any justice.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you. I think you're right in many instances, but there were white vigilantes in the North who rode at night and ran black people off their land. In the Ann Arbor, Michigan of the 1950s, where I grew up, if a black kid stepped across Division Street, the cops were called. And Ann Arbor was home of the University of Michigan, called itself the Athens of the Middle West. You know.
At picnics where people watch someone being burned, have their body pieces sold as souvenirs and pictures.
Yeah.
That was common. That did not happen in Florida. One really sick and tired of you saying, oh, it was bad where I lived too. You know what? It wasn't as bad. Take it from people that know ancestors came from both sides, in the North and in the South. There was a difference.
And you're absolutely right. And I've given a wrong impression if it sounds like I'm setting up an absolute equivalence. I mean, there's history. There was a war about this stuff, and the North was on one side, the South was on the other. I didn't mean to erase the importance of that history. I just don't think you can give white Northerners a total pass on racism. I mean, look at the country today. Do you believe that white people in the North are devoid of racism? I may have lost you there. And anyway, listen, let me, I want to come back. There's not much time to this final point that has to do with Dallas, and it came up at this city council retreat. The speaker was Zan Holmes, who many of you would know, the founding pastor of St. Luke Community Methodist Church, a very important African-American leader for many years, now retired. And Dallas City Councilwoman Carolyn Davis, who's African-American, asked him if it was true that the ministers in Dallas back in the 60s were hostile to Martin Luther King Jr. And Holmes said, yes, somewhat true. That happened. He didn't get time to finish what he was saying, but he said that had to do, however, with the denominational split within the black church. That's a very important piece of history, too, that we never get to. And it has to do with Martin Luther King Sr. The senior king is always lost in the shadow of his son, but he was an important leader in the black church. The black church was split between people who believed in what was then called assimilation. We would call it integration now. And black people who were more like Rosa Parks, who were Marcus Garvey separatists, who wanted nothing to do with white people. They didn't want to be anywhere near white people. And that was not because they were knuckling under or accepting the white regime. It was because they didn't like white people and didn't respect them. And Dallas was a center of that separatist movement in the black church, in the black Baptist church. Martin Luther King Sr. led a big battle, and his wing of the church, which was the assimilationist pro-integration wing of the church, won the battle and sort of took over the church. The black clergy in Dallas remembered all of that. They were very much involved in it. So when Martin Luther King Jr. came here, this was that King family that they already knew and they disagreed with. Dallas has remained anomalously a center of separatist feeling. In the 1980s, Bernard Lafayette came here from Tuskegee and did sort of he's a scholar of the movement and did a kind of consultancy on Black Dallas and came to the conclusion that Dallas was unique in the country as remaining a center of separatist sentiment in the black community. That gets muddled when we look back, and it is sometimes characterized as Uncle Tomism. I think as history gets more distant from it and we begin to peel this onion and tell the story more accurately, we will see that that's not fair. Who was more radical? The people who wanted to go live among the white people or the people who didn't want anything to do with white people? That's a question that's above my pay grade, but nobody in that picture comes out as an Uncle Tom. That's a complicated bit of history. It's just interesting that only now are we beginning to be able to unravel some of this and see it more accurately and to see Rosa Parks more accurately. As the caller said, she got the right version in school, that the civil rights movement was strategic and it was focused and was doing what it did in order to change history. It presented itself. It told the Rosa Parks story differently. It told a story about Rosa Parks that wasn't true, that she was just this humble, quiet lady who had too much. I think it's because they knew that that was the most that white people could take. That if they were appealing to white conscience, and they weren't quite ready to say, oh, and by the way, we're smarter than you are. We're ahead of you. We're running this show. We're running this history. We may be the minority, but we are wagging the dog. We are changing history from our minority position. So there was a little bit of posing still, a posturing that involves a little more guileless innocence than was the case. But as history unfolds, what we get back to is a much more believable story, that these were smart people who knew what they were doing. Their reaction to the indignities of segregation were always what human reaction would be and should be, which was fury and anger. Excuse me. They did not ever have some kind of deep-seated respect for the people who were oppressing them. It was quite the contrary. Anyway, it's just if you get a chance, if you see this book, I'm going to go look for it, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, by Jean Theoharis, Brooklyn College professor, and it just sounds to me like a fascinating window on the real Rosa Parks. This is Jim Shute.
This is William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like, follow, or subscribe to us and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call.